It's a debate that's divided gamers for decades. To invert or not to invert? That is, your y-axis, the up and down look direction. Back in December, a friend linked me to an article that put forward this y-invert question to passionate response, even as far as inciting an investigation by neuroscientists. Meanwhile I, having played around with making this video concept, and in fact the entire channel, for about a year, felt this warranted a call to action. People besides me may actually be interested in this stuff after all. Thus, with great haste, after about half a year, I set to work. Disclaimer. What follows probably constitutes what Wikipedia damningly calls original research. I don't know the exact outcome of the study in the article, but suffice to say this video is effectively my own take on things, hopefully utilising my experiences in game dev and aviation. At this point, it's worth making note of what we actually mean by up. When you look at just about any control interface, be it joypad, joystick or mouse, what is really being pressed is forward. We commonly call it up, but the reason for this is historical, as we shall see. Our brains do incredible translations under the hood and without us being consciously aware of it all the time. When asked to interpret pushing forward as up or down, there are two ways our brains can implement what is called mapping, either as a translation or a rotation. The majority of gamers follow a convention that was established way back in the early days of computing. When programmers sought to translate smooth movement of a mouse on a rectangle of desk to a rectangle on the screen, it made sense to project its position as though the screen was face up on the desk, much like a modern tablet sitting where the mousepad is. This is a translation mapping, and if you want to point to part of a screen, it makes perfectly good sense. It also made perfect sense for keyboard controls and interfaces, as things were just sliding around a flat view with no practical depth. And so begins our conflation of forward and up. Early 3D games started to push this into new territory, now needing some way to move forward, the exciting new Z direction. Both up arrow key and forward joystick could be found used for this purpose, as in any case the games remained mechanically 2D, just orientated on a plane more familiar to the human experience. The now ubiquitous ability to look up and down actually came pretty late to the first-person genre. As recently as Duke Nukem 3D in 1996, shooter games still expected the average player to navigate the level with the keyboard, like you were driving a tank that could open doors, while mouse look, as it was known, was a mark of the hardcore. Gradually games started to fill out into their 3D worlds, and increasingly required the players to be able to look around them, prompting the need for both vertical looking and forward-backward to be used together. But now, in the world of 3D, looking up was a rotation. This raised an important distinction that was to start 1,000 flame wars. There was another genre already well familiar with navigating the third dimension, which initially had a lot of influence on how people mapped this new axis. It's pretty well known that invert originated likely with the flight sims. But why do planes use this convention of pressing up to go down? Well, let's go back to our premise and look instead at how the stick rotates when we push forward. Assuming the pivot of our stick as our reference, pushing forward will rotate whatever that is to dive toward the ground. This is why almost every aircraft ever built is controlled in this way. The moving of control surfaces, as they are known, is first and foremost to bring about a rotation. If we're to take the pivot of your joystick as the pivot of whatever you're controlling, be it a plane, a starship, or your player's head, forward down is really the only sensible way to describe rotation. If you're controlling something in terms of pointing at a certain part of the screen, it makes sense to use forward up. The issue and the contention here is that characters in video games can be thought of in both ways. It's worth mentioning that there is an alternate, sort of unrelated, source of invert, mainly affecting third-person games, and this one is not just vertical, but horizontal too. Essentially, it comes down to whether a player sees themselves as the object the camera focuses on, or the camera itself. If you picture any input going into either A or B here, you can see the result would be the opposite of what you expect, depending on which you were hooked into. This one is very contextual, although the previous mapping dilemma muddies it further. Side note, you don't actually need a rotating control, like a joystick, to still think in terms of rotational mapping. When you think about it, this makes sense. We're used to converting forward into a downward rotation because most objects pivot at the bottom, where they make contact with the ground. Anyway, so to ask why gamers invert their controls is to start from a flawed premise. There is no inverting going on here, just two equally sensible conventions with differing emphasis, pointing or rotating. But because one of them, the pointing convention, has been core to our user interfaces and become the mainstay of the highly popular FPS genre, it has become dominant generally. This leads to game devs being pressured into making it the default even in flight sims. But I digress. I think we need a better term, in flight sims if nothing else. Maybe y-axis forward equals up, forward equals down. After all, it understandably gets people's backs up to imply they're doing something wrong, even more so when it's from a position of ignorance. Also, it's not actually that clear if inverted means opposite to the gamer convention, or opposite to what it actually is meant to be for a given use. Anyway, that's all from me. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.